Good morning. There we go. Welcome to the Carroll County Veterans Memorial Park Association's Veterans Day ceremony. Once again, I'm honored to be the Master of Ceremonies here at what I believe is the finest Veterans Park in West Georgia. On behalf of the Park Association, I thank you all for your continued support of Carroll County Park and Carroll County's veterans. Before we begin, and those of you who have seen me here in the past, you'll know I have the same announcement. about administratively what the most important thing is, and that's restrooms. So, a porta potty is located to my right. Restrooms are located directly to the rear in the Pathways building, and at this time I use the old Army adage, given the choice, never pass up porcelain. So, if you got a choice, use the bathrooms back there. Believe me, they're a lot better. If you don't have a program, please let us know, and we'll get one out to you. At this time, I'd like to thank the Air Force JROTC cadets from Central High School and the Boy Scouts from Troop 2424 for assisting in the program distribution, parking, and helping people locate the restrooms. I'd also always like to thank Terry Lowry and the Carroll County Wind Ensemble. Their continued support at these events really makes the day. That music sets the theme and gets the heart pumping and gets us ready to go to honor veterans. So once again, Terry, thank you. The other thing that gets the heart pumping is being at this end, looking out that way at the crowd. It just shows the support that veterans have, and we're very lucky to have this support here in West Georgia. I've said this before, in my 25 years in the Army traveling all around the world, I don't think I've ever met a more patriotic group than what we have right here. So you guys need to be saluted. Thank you. Veterans Day is the day that the nation recognizes all veterans, those who have answered the call and served in our nation's military. Here at the Veterans Park, in addition to recognize all who are serving and who have served, we give special recognition to those who have served in specific periods in our history. We began on Veterans Day in 2012 by honoring veterans of World War II, then the Korean War, followed by the Vietnam War. Today, we'll recognize those veterans that served during the Cold War, the period between 1946 and 1991. You may have noticed that today I'm not wearing my Class A uniform that I normally wear. I'm wearing my battle dress uniform, or BDU, because this is the uniform I wore most of the time during the Cold War. And believe me, it still fits, even though it's a little tighter. And by the way, Sergeant Major, I still have my dog tags. So now that we've had a uniform check, we can move further on. At this time, I'd like to ask Don Levins, the Park Association President, to lead us in a prayer. Don?
Please join me in prayer. Almighty God, you moved upon our founders to establish this great nation. You stirred them to hope and to dream for a land of freedom. We praise you for this great land of the free. Lord, many of our best and brightest proudly stand and defend our beloved country. You have given us brave and loyal men and women who have steadfastly served in their chosen branch of our military. We gather today to remember, recognize, and honor those who served during the Cold War. We acknowledge that their service enables us to walk as free men and women in this great land. Lord, today we seek to honor all your sons and daughters who have served or who are serving in our country. We are reminded that because of their service, we also live in safety. We ask that you abundantly bless all those who have previously served, as well as those currently serving. May their service time be rewarded in every way. May they gain earthly and heavenly blessings for their unselfish love of country. May each of our veterans feel honored, not just today, but in every way. Father, we thank you for your blessing of this wonderful Veterans Memorial Park. Thank you for the citizens, businesses, clubs, churches, and government entities that support the Park Association. And while I'm at it, Father, I want to thank you for the members, officers, and committees of the Carroll County Veterans Memorial Park Association for their dedication, their vision, their attention to detail, and their cooperation. Because of them, the support of the community, we enjoy the impeccable view that surrounds us at this moment. We ask now that you bless this service as we honor and remember especially those who served our nation throughout the turmoil of what came to be called the Cold War. We pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen.
I usually say something about having a good chaplain taking care of the weather. Well, in this case, Don must have connections also, because we're talking about the Cold War, and believe me, it's cold out here. So you've got connections also, Don. Thank you. Please stand, if you're able, for the presentation of the colors by a Carroll County Joint Honor Guard from Central High School, Air Force JROTC, and then remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, the National Anthem, the laying of the wreath, rifle salute, and taps. Colors, post. Present arms. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
At this time, representatives of local veterans organizations, assisted by the Carrollton High School JROTC Honor Guard, will place a wreath in honor of this nation's veterans. Colors, retire the colors. Participating in the organization are American Legion Post 143, Military Officers Association of America, Marine Corps League, Veterans of Foreign Wars, AMVETS Post 99, Sons of the American Revolution, Sons of Confederate Veterans, and Disabled American Veterans. Present arms. Order, arms. Please be seated. We are most honored to have as our keynote speaker the chair of the History Department of the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of West Georgia, Dr. Steve Goodson. Dr. Goodson has accepted the challenge of covering the approximately 46 years of the Cold War in about 30 minutes. So we're going to see how he does. So Dr. Goodson, it's all yours.
Oops. Thank you. It's an honor to be invited here to speak before so many veterans and their families. I have a couple of goals. One is to briefly cover the basics of the Cold War, the origins, some of the most important incidents of the Cold War. The other goal is to not let my notes blow away while I'm doing it. So I'm going to keep a tight grip on them. The Cold War was a global struggle between the U.S. and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies that went on for 4.5 decades following World War II. We refer to it as a Cold War because the Soviets and the Americans never went to war with each other. Neither ever attacked the other's homeland. Rather, the war was fought through other methods, the creation of rival alliances, the extension of military and economic aid to allies or potential allies, a huge, tremendously expensive arms race between the two countries, propaganda campaigns, espionage and subversion, guerrilla warfare, warfare through other countries such as Korea and Vietnam. So the war was fought in a variety of ways, but not between the Soviets and the Americans in terms of real shooting at each other warfare. The war was fought on, touched every continent in the world and even involved outer space. The origins of the Cold War go back to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the victory of the communists in that revolution and the eventual establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. The ideology of communism was opposed to bedrock American values such as capitalism and free enterprise, political democracy, organized religion. Plus, it was international in its aims. The goal wasn't to overthrow the Tsar of Russia and stop there. The goal of communism was international revolution that would overthrow capitalist governments everywhere. So from the very beginning, the U.S. saw the Soviet Union as a grave threat. The U.S. didn't formally recognize the existence of the Soviet Union until 1933. Now, a few years later, World War II created an uneasy alliance between the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. The war began in September of 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. The U.S. didn't enter the war until December of 1941, as you know. Meanwhile, up to that point, the U.S. provided desperately needed supplies to Great Britain, which found itself holding out alone against Germany. But on June 22, 1941, Germany launched a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. It was a surprise to Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin because 2 years before, Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact, promising not to attack each other. But obviously Hitler didn't honor that pact. Many Americans were ambivalent about the possibility of being on the same side as the Soviets against the Germans. Harry S. Truman, who was a senator at that time, was quoted as saying, "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. Though I don't want to see Hitler victorious in any circumstances." British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, on the other hand, was less reluctant to accept the Soviets as an ally. He told his secretary, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." President Roosevelt didn't have any qualms about accepting the Soviet Union as an ally. The U.S. began shipping millions of tons of supplies to the Soviets under the Lend-Lease program, the same program by which we were sending supplies to Great Britain. Once the U.S. entered the war in December, then, there was what was called a Grand Alliance between the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. But there were tensions within that alliance. The Soviets never entirely trusted the British and Americans. The British and Americans never entirely trusted the Soviets. But still, they managed to hold together this alliance as long as they had a common enemy. But the common enemies were gone by the end of 1945, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union were left the most militarily powerful countries in the world. So once again, the focus turned to differences between them, different aims, radically different ideologies, and relations between the two countries pretty quickly unraveled in the years following World War II. One of the sticking points for the U.S. was the Soviet domination of the nations of Eastern Europe that it had liberated from the Germans during the war. Responding to Soviet pressures on Turkey and Greece, President Truman made a historic speech to Congress on March 12, 1947. He asked for $400 million worth of economic aid for Greece and Turkey and for the authority to send U.S. military personnel to train soldiers in those countries. In the most famous statement of that speech, he said, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures." And this statement became known as the Truman Doctrine. And the heart of the Truman Doctrine was the idea of containment, the idea that the U.S. had a responsibility to prevent the expansion of communism beyond its existing borders. In other words, the United States would play a role much like a global policeman, kind of patrolling the world to make sure that the communists didn't gain additional territory. Now, this is one way, I'm going to mention several, in which the post-World War II period was very different from the post-World War I period. Following World War I, President Woodrow Wilson hoped that the U.S. Senate would ratify the Treaty of Versailles and that the U.S. would become part of the new League of Nations, which he hoped would prevent future wars. But the U.S. never ratified the treaty, never joined the League, and retreated to a kind of isolation from the rest of the world during the 1920s and 1930s. Following World War II, by contrast, here you see Truman stating that it's the responsibility of the United States to defend people everywhere who are threatened by the expansion of communism. So we're going to take a much more active role. The U.S. faced a host of challenges in the Cold War in the late 1940s. One of those involved Berlin. At the end of World War II, Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones, each under the control of one of the major allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone of occupation. It was also divided into occupation zones by the Allies so that there was an East and a West Berlin. In 1948, the U.S., Great Britain, and France began the process of unifying their German occupation zones into what would eventually become an independent country, West Germany. The Soviets were very much opposed to this plan, so in April 1948, they began restricting the flow of traffic into West Berlin in their zone. On June 24, 1948, they cut off the traffic altogether, leaving more than 2 million West Berliners without supplies of food, fuel, and other necessities. The Soviet government hoped to force the Allies either to give up Berlin or to give up plans to unify West Germany. But General Lucius Clay, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, stated in response to the blockade of Berlin, "When Berlin falls, Western Germany will be next. If we mean to hold Europe against communism, we must not budge." President Truman agreed, and the result was what became known as the Berlin Airlift. West Berlin would be supplied through the skies. Now, initially this seemed impossible because it was going to require 4,500 tons of just food a day to supply the West Berliners. But the Allies brought in planes from all over the world, and by October they were flying in about 5,000 tons of food a day to West Berlin. Between June 1948 and May 1949, more than 1.5 million tons of supplies were brought into West Berlin by the Allies, and that was more than 1/2 ton for each West Berliner. Faced with failure in the blockade, the Soviets ended the blockade on May 12, 1949. That same May, West Germany adopted a constitution and became the German Federal Republic, functioning by the end of the year. Also in 1949, the Soviets formed the German Democratic Republic in their eastern zone. So by the end of 49, Germany had been formally divided into 2 separate countries. Also in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by the U.S. and a number of its allies, which created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a mutual defense organization in which an attack on any one of these countries would be considered an attack on all of them. In 1950, NATO created an integrated defense force in Western Europe. And again, this is contrasts sharply to previous U.S. practice after wars. There was a long history in the U.S. of this idea that during peacetime you avoid what were called entangling alliances. It's okay to have allies during wartime, but during peacetime you retreat back, mind your own business, and don't ally with other countries. World War II and the Cold War changed that, and we're going to form a number of pacts around the world of allies to help prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union responded a few years later by creating what became known as the Warsaw Pact of its allies in a military organization. So by that point, by the mid-50s, then Europe is formally divided between two heavily armed sides facing one another. There were two ominous developments in the fall of 1949. One is that a civil war that had been going on in China ended with the victory of the communist forces there. This meant that the communists would now control the most populous country in the world. Also in the fall of 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, ending the monopoly that the U.S. had had on nuclear weapons. This led to a couple of actions on the part of the Truman administration. One was the decision to go through with the development of a hydrogen bomb, which would be much more powerful than existing bombs. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their blast power was measured in terms of thousands of tons of TNT. A hydrogen bomb, its power would be measured in terms of millions of tons of TNT. So it was going to be much more powerful. The U.S. developed its first hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviets followed 9 months later by exploding their first atomic bomb. Another result of the Soviets getting the atomic bomb was that Truman administration decided to rebuild the conventional, the non-nuclear military, which had been allowed to dwindle following World War II, while we were the only country that had the atomic bomb. This goes against another long-standing principle. There had always been resistance in American history against having a large standing army in peacetime. The army was supposed to shrink dramatically when we weren't at war. But the Cold War changes that again. So we're going to have a large army even in times when we're not directly fighting in a war. In 1950, the focus turned to Korea. Korea had been occupied by Japan until the end of World War II. Then afterward, like Germany, it was divided into occupation zones, with the U.S. occupying southern Korea and the Soviet Union occupying northern Korea, with a division at the 38th parallel. By the end of 1949, the Soviets and Americans had pulled out of Korea, but the Soviets left a heavily armed communist government in North Korea, and the U.S. left a heavily armed non-communist government in South Korea. So these two mutual halves of Korea are looking at each other across this imaginary line on the map, each determined to ultimately unify Korea on its own terms. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea poured troops across the 38th parallel into South Korea, making its bid to reunify the Korean peninsula under its control. At President Truman's request, the UN Security Council held an urgent meeting in which it asked its members to come to the aid of South Korea. Ultimately, 19 nations contributed to the UN war effort in Korea, but the vast majority of the troops and the military and the command were provided by the United States. By August of 1950, UN forces, I should say technically, had almost been pushed into the sea around Busan in southeastern Korea, but the UN forces counterattacked by late October. They counterattacked, ended up moving beyond the 38th parallel. The goal of the war changed from defending South Korea, pushing the North Koreans out, to crossing the 38th parallel and then reunifying Korea under anti-communist control. By late October, UN forces were beginning to reach the Yalu River, which divided China from Korea. And on the 25th of November, 1950, China suddenly poured hundreds of thousands of its troops into North Korea to help the North Koreans fight the U.S. UN forces. The U.S. was pushed again, the U.S. was pushed back down below the 38th parallel, but then ultimately regrouped and pushed back, and gradually the dividing line stabilized into a stalemate around the 38th parallel. The war dragged on for a couple of years before an armistice was signed in late July 1953. The U.S. suffered 140,000 casualties in Korea, with more than 33,000 killed. The dividing line between the two countries ended up being roughly the 38th parallel again, and as we know from the news today, a divided Korea with a communist government in the north is one of the lasting legacies of the Cold War. The Cold War entered the Western Hemisphere in dramatic fashion in 1959 when forces led by Fidel Castro overthrew the corrupt dictator of Korea. Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida, so what happened there was going to be of grave concern to the U.S. government. Castro eventually aligned himself with communists and the Soviet Union. One of President Eisenhower's last acts in office in January of 1961 was to break off diplomatic relations with Cuba. John F. Kennedy took office on January 20th, 1961, and he inherited a plan from the Eisenhower administration by which CIA-trained Cuban exiles would invade Cuba, and the goal would be to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. Kennedy decided to go forth with this plan. The invasion was attempted in April 1961, 3 months after Kennedy took office. It was a complete disaster, and it was a personal humiliation to Kennedy. Perhaps sensing weakness and fearing ultimately that the U.S. would invade Cuba, early in 1962, the Soviets began secretly constructing nuclear missile sites in Cuba, and that led to the most serious crisis of the Cold War. U.S. spy plane photos taken on October 14, 1962, revealed that these missile sites were being constructed, which began an intense top-secret debate within the Kennedy administration about how to respond, with the determination that one way or the other, the missiles were going to have to be removed. Kennedy resisted calls for an all-out invasion of Cuba and decided to start with a naval blockade of Cuba, what he called a quarantine, naval quarantine of Cuba, to prevent additional Soviet supplies from getting in. He put the military on high alert in preparation for a possible invasion of Cuba later, or in preparation for a nuclear war. He went on national television on October 22nd and announced the situation to the American people, that the missiles were in Cuba, that the U.S. was going to quarantine Cuba. He also said in that speech, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack on the U.S., requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." So the U.S. and the Soviets are edging to the closest they ever came to all-out nuclear war. The Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev angrily stated that his ships would not stop at the U.S. blockade line. So it's one of the tensest weeks in world history as people wait to see what will happen when the first Soviet ships do arrive at the U.S. quarantine line. Soviet ships do pull up short and don't challenge the blockade. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, negotiations are going on, and ultimately Nikita Khrushchev agrees to remove his missiles from Cuba if the U.S. will pledge not to invade Cuba in the future. And as a secret part of the deal, the U.S. agreed to remove obsolete nuclear missiles that we had in Turkey facing the Soviet Union. Again, this is the closest the world came during the Cold War to all-out nuclear war. It had some good outcomes. The Soviets and Americans agreed to establish a hotline, a direct telephone line between the White House and the Kremlin so that the leaders could discuss instantaneously crises that developed in the future. It also helped lead to a limited test ban treaty that the U.S. and Soviets signed in September 1963, an agreement to stop testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, which is a relatively small step, but it showed that the U.S. and the Soviets could productively negotiate with each other about nuclear weapons if they set their minds to it. Vietnam is an enormously complicated story, as you know, and we don't have time to go into the details of that conflict today. But what I do want to point out is how much Vietnam was a product of the Cold War and this idea of containment. Because the very purpose of the war was to prevent the expansion of communist control from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. So to contain communism outside of South Vietnam. Relatedly, the U.S. talked about the domino theory, which was its belief that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, it would be like the first in a row of dominoes, and one country after another would fall to the communists. The first combat troops were sent into Vietnam, first U.S. combat troops in March of 1965. The last troops pulled out in 1973. Just over 58,000 Americans were killed in the Vietnam War. President Richard Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger promoted a policy of détente with the Soviet Union, by which they meant an easing of relations, a relaxation of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets. And there were some successes under this policy. Nixon became the first president to visit the Soviet Union, and he signed a strategic arms limitation treaty with Premier Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union. But over the course of the 1970s, détente eroded and collapsed. Probably the last nail in the coffin of the détente idea came with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. They were seeking to prop up a communist government there. This led the United States to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics, which were held in Moscow. The next year, Ronald Reagan entered office, and he came in taking a very hard line against the Soviets and the communists. He claimed that détente was a misguided mistake, that it was impossible to deal with the Soviets, that working with them amounted to appeasing them and helping them continue the communist regime. In March 1983, he famously referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And later that year, 1,900 U.S. troops were sent to the Caribbean island nation of Grenada to liberate it from a Marxist government that Reagan referred to as a brutal gang of leftist thugs. But remarkably, after Soviet reformer Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev were able to establish a good working relationship. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev would sign the first major nuclear arms reduction agreement of the entire Cold War. But Gorbachev's reforms made dissent possible in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and beginning in 1989 with Poland, Eastern European countries began to elect non-communist governments and to break away from Soviet control. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had been established in 1961 by the Soviets to divide East and West Berlin, the wall came down. Germany formally reunited in 1990, and the Soviet Union itself, its government began to disintegrate. Provinces were leaving the Soviet Union for independence, and the USSR finally formally ended its existence on December 31st, 1991. So putting a definitive end to the Cold War. I hope that overview has been helpful. I never served in the military. My father was in the Army for 2 years during the Korean War. He spent most of the war in Colorado, and for the rest of his life, he liked to boast that not a single Korean got into Colorado while he was there. But again, it's an honor to speak to you all, and I want to thank the veterans for dedicating a part of your life to defending the United States and what it stands for, and thank you for having me.
Well, 46 years and 23 minutes. Sir?
Cold, I rushed.
So you accomplished the mission. Fantastic. Well done. As you've probably heard, I'm going to hit a few things here, but I'm not going to redo the speech again. But in 1947, the Iron Curtain descended across Europe. The term Iron Curtain as a Cold War symbol is attributed to its use in a speech by Sir Winston Churchill in 1946. About 35 million people served during the Cold War. I think it would be safe to say that that includes most of the veterans here today. As a Cold War veteran, you have lived through numerous alerts, exercises, deployments, cruises, rotations, TDYs and TADs to the far corners of the world, and not to forget the hours of plain old guard duty, on the border, in the motor pool, on the flight line, on the deck, on the dock, or along some lonely fence line. 46 years was a long time on guard duty, but you served, and because of that service, the spread of communism was contained. As I call out some of the events of the Cold War, if you participated in the event or served during that event, I'm going to ask you to please stand, and then remain standing until the roll call of events is concluded. We'll see how close my prediction comes to having the entire audience of veterans standing. We'll ring the park bell in recognition of your service. The first incident, 1945 to 1952, the occupation of Japan. 1945 to 1955, the occupation of Germany. Within the occupation of Germany, 24 June 1948 through 28 May 1949, the Berlin Blockade, excuse me. In 1949, NATO forms, continuing to the end of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. That should be a lot of folks there. In 1950, Eisenhower was assigned to SHAPE. 1950 also saw the beginning of the nuclear arms race with the Army's Pentomic Division, the bombers and missiles of the Strategic Air Command, the DEW Line, the Navy ballistic missile submarines. And personally, I fondly remember Reforger, Able Archer, and Lariat Advance, all those exercises we had in USER, always getting up in the middle of the night, heading out to the GDP, and they all happened at night, going uphill in the cold. I don't care what happened, it was always then. It's been mentioned, the 25th of June 1950 to the 31st of July 1955, the Korean conflict. Would all Korean War vets please stand? 1954, the formulation of SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, sort of a Pacific region NATO, with all who served in Korea, Okinawa, Japan, the Philippines, or in the seas in those places, please stand. 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1961 through May of 1975, the Vietnam War. 1968, the U.S. Pueblo incident. 1976, the tree cutting incident in the Joint Security Area, the DMZ in Korea. Though not part of the Cold War, 24 August 1982 through 31 July 1984, Grenada. 20 December 1968 to January 1990, Panama. If I failed to mention your specific part of the Cold War, please accept my apology and stand at this time. As I predicted, we've got quite a few people standing, so all of us are Cold War veterans. As I said earlier, Veterans Day honors all veterans, so at this time would all veterans please stand? Looking around at these Carroll County patriots, we're very fortunate for the service that they have performed. Now would everybody stand with the veterans for the singing of God Bless America? Please sing along.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Please be seated. I invite you one more time to look around the great Veterans Park. Since its beginning in 2000 with 12 walls of honor, the park has continued to improve thanks to the hard work and community and business involvement and the financial support of the citizens of West Georgia. It's your commitment to honor veterans that have made this park possible. For additional information on the park, ways you can honor veterans here at the park, or to make a contribution to the expansion, please contact us at the numbers on the sign over there to my left. Thanks to all who supported in this presentation. Thanks to all who provided the support for this great ceremony. Thanks to the organizations that are listed on the back of the program. And most importantly, thanks to the veterans and their families for your sacrifice and service. I invite you, that's worth it, okay. I invite you all to join us on Saturday, December the 16th at 12 noon here at the Veterans Park as we join the nation in the Wreaths Across America ceremony in honor of fallen veterans. This ceremony is a placement of over 400,000 wreaths in cemeteries and memorials across the United States and overseas. Here at the Vet Park, we'll be putting ceremonial flags at the base of the service flags to my rear. It's a real short ceremony, but it's a very meaningful ceremony. So December the 16th, 12 noon, here at the park, and I assure you it'll be colder then. So this concludes the ceremony. I want to thank you for coming out. It's always great to see the support that we veterans receive here. Be safe and be careful on your way home. Thank you very much.